This is great. So I want to thank everyone for coming, especially our speaker, Rabbi Wakschlag, or as we call him in our family, I'm Rob's grandfather. Thank you so much for coming. It's really special that, and really I think we've done a number of these lectures over the years about really important figures in the history of the Torah and its transmission. We spoke about Rashi, we spoke about Nehemiah Leibovitz, we spoke about the Ramban. I think this is the first time we have an actual, a real close student in Talmud of a person whose ideas and life we're studying, and that's a real privilege and really special. And I'm just really grateful for Rabbi Wakschlag for sharing this material with us this evening. So please.
Certainly, thanks. And just so everybody gets a almost really life-size, I guess, headshot for mood and general atmosphere. I brought this. This is actually the picture, the portrait that was taken around the time that Rabbi Soloveichik came to Chicago. We'll get into more detail now, but since it's so prominent, I thought maybe I'd explain it. And a copy of this hangs in the Hebrew Theological College, their gallery of Rosh Yeshiva, which I think is being redone right now. I'm not sure, but this is the official portrait, and it's a good one because what you typically see, especially in the books, the flyleaf and all of that, are pictures in old age, and this is a picture in his sort of vigorous, more youthful, and very prominent period of life. So I, thank you, Rabbi, for inviting me to come to speak about someone who was so important in my life, and I'm glad that he was included in the Chicago Rabbi series. Certainly a lot of prominent and important rabbis in Chicago, a parade of important rabbis, and certainly Rabbi Soloveichik was at least among them. And I'm glad that he was included in this, and that I have the opportunity to talk about him. So I appreciate that. I think that this podium is usually occupied by the rabbi or the rabbinate, and so it's a special privilege to be able to be here and speak to you. So you all have source sheets, I hope, a little booklet. And we'll cover much of what's in here, but it's more than what I expect to cover or to touch on. Maybe we'll mention everything that's in here, but it's also for further reading and ideas if you'd like to follow up. It should be easy to find me too if anybody wants to follow up with me on anything in particular here. One other brief thing before we start, an opening point is to turn off my iPhone. And another one is to mention this. I have a dedication just in the page after the cover page. I've designated Romanette I. And this is a tribute to the memory of David Landis, Olav Shalom. I don't know if anyone here knows the Landis family. People know the Landis? Yeah. David Landis was someone about my age, and we went to law school together, and he lived in this neighborhood for some time, grew up on the south side, and attended Agudas Achim with his family. Then for a while, the family lived nearby on Lakeshore Drive, and they made this their shul. My first encounter with this shul was at his Ofruf, which was celebrated here, and that was a lot of fun. Unfortunately, he had a series of illnesses and finally succumbed just about a month ago. Lived in Teaneck at this point. The family has been spread out around Israel, New York area, elsewhere. But he passed away. I was very saddened by that. We used to study Talmud together between courses that we took together in law school. or we attempted to study Talmud. There was some Talmud study and a lot of other stuff about law school, but I have very fond memories of him. I'll let you read the obituaries. He was a wonderful person and a wonderful scholar, and he will be missed. So, Tehei Nishmato Tzrura B'Tzora Chaya. We move on then to page 1. So here we have to address the opening question is, how do we spend an hour talking about Rav Aaron? How should we encapsulate the life of Rav Aaron? Because maybe like all complex, significant, dynamic individuals, he had many sides. And there are so many ways that, so many things that we could focus on in talking about Rav Aaron Soloveichik. Inevitably, there are the controversies that he was involved in, that many people know him for in Chicago. In some circles, that was what he was known for. Beyond that, there were the decades of Torah scholarship and Torah teaching that he did, as you'll see on the next page in the timeline. He's been teaching Torah at various yeshivas, mostly Yeshiva University and Skokie Yeshiva, and then Brisk, for many years. He is responsible for many published articles in Halacha, many in those mostly in Hebrew. In English, there are 2 books that are collections of his essays. And in Hebrew, there are halachic books as well, containing his thoughts and also his pesika, his psak halacha, decision-making and conclusions on important issues of the day. And my wife and I had a personal relationship with him, and he was extremely important to us, in particular in the development of services in this city for children with disabilities. And in the early days of Keshet, for those of you who are familiar with that organization, in the formative years of that, there were important community issues that arose, community/halachic, /political, issues that arose. Those slashes are probably always in there, all together in one stew. And we sought his guidance, and partly because of his wisdom, and then also largely because he was the definitive, conclusive authority, so that if there were objections to anything, questions or whatever, rumors coming from different quarters of the community, they could be quieted by a decision by Rabbi Soloveichik that the approach we were taking was appropriate and halachically sound. So there were a number of occasions where that was important. And I could talk, I could literally talk for an hour just on that slice of our relationship with Rabbi Soloveichik. But what I chose to do, rather than all of that per se, is maybe something that in a way combines it all, which is, what I'd like to do is, to the best that I can, sort of identify what did Rav Aaron think of as his mission. And if we attempt to do that, of course there's a lot of hubris involved in thinking that we can step into the mind of the man, and I don't think that I can, but we can attempt to see from his actions what was really the core mission in his life, at least as we knew it in Chicago. And that, I believe, was, if not the core mission, but certainly a core mission, was giving guidance on the halachic issues of American Judaism in the post-war period. And sort of setting orthodoxy right again. And that meant not, as some might have it, replicate European orthodoxy, pre-war orthodoxy in the post-war, World War II, of course I'm talking about, in the post-war period here in Chicago. It didn't mean that. It wasn't exactly that. But on the other hand, it also wasn't, compromising to progressive movements and giving up on core halachic principles, or even ancillary halachic principles. He didn't compromise on halachic principles, but making it work so that you also didn't have halachic principles that were unnecessary or irrelevant for the circumstances. He spoke honestly and with integrity about what halacha did require and what it didn't require. And what it did require, he stood by steadfastly. What it didn't require, he permitted to be placed in a secondary position or made optional or whatever was appropriate under the circumstances. So kind of setting normative practice and making sure that American Judaism, Orthodox Judaism, was consistent with what should be expected of it under halachic, under honest, strict halachic norms. I think that was the mission. That was a core mission. And trying to attempt to achieve that, your outline shows that what I'd like to do is to take two areas that I chose almost at random, but not exactly, because they are areas where he had clear, on the record positions that we can trace, further developments from those positions. So in other words, places where he had a strong influence, and there is substantial literature on it. And I chose two areas in which that was the case, and where there was, I think I just said substantial literature, so that we have a good record of what was going on. And I chose two broad areas for that. One on the sort of the ritual, religious side was what I'm calling part one, the influence on women's expanding role in orthodoxy. He had much to say about that, as we'll see. And then, very importantly, in a broader halachic sense, he believed everything was halacha. So not just, shilas about carrying on Shabbos or whatever, purely ritual things which you associate with being purely halachic. But he believed that pretty much everything under the sun was a halachic question. How a Jew should practice was a halachic question, and not one just to be decided on a whim or personal preference. So in part two, another halachic area of his that otherwise one might think is purely political was his sense of what the duties of a Jewish person are as a citizen of this country and as a citizen of the world. Very important areas of interest for Rabbi Soloveichik. All of this is on the question of how we should think about Ravarin, and I take that my stepping off point is the quotation on the top of the page. This was from Ariel Sharon, Alav Shalom, who was a minister, not quite prime minister yet, in 1997, but a minister in the government. And he was invited to give the keynote address, or an important address, at an 80th birthday banquet that we had, also a fundraiser for the Brisk Yeshiva that Rabbi Soloveichik headed up. We did that in New York, and Ariel Sharon spoke there. And very memorably, this isn't written anywhere, I think we may have a tape, but I'll never forget. how Ariel Sharon got up and said, when I think of Rabbi Soloveichik, I think of the pasuk in Yeshayahu, Toa Shemayim, L'Yisod Haaretz, L'Mor L'Tzion Amiyata. And that sunk in for me, and I came to realize that I don't know that he explained explicitly why this pasuk reminded him of Ravarin, or Ravarin reminded him of this pasuk. But I figured out why it reminded me of Ravarin, or encapsulated Ravarin in a way. And that's because it covers exactly the three areas that are of most concern that we knew about in Ravarin's life and in his halachic and intellectual interests. So lintoa shamayim, to plant, cultivate the heavens, v'lisod haaretz, and to make the earth firm, v'lemor l'tzion amiyata. Those clearly, to me, relate to the ritual law, lintoa shamayim, to cultivate the heavens, v'lisod haaretz, and to make sure that there's a strong ethical practice and life within humankind here on earth and just among people, and then his Zionism, which of course was very important to him as well. And so those are three areas that he was much involved in. And I guess the two that I've chosen for filling our hour in talking about his role and his contribution correspond more or less to Lintoa Shamayim, which has to do with the role of women in Orthodoxy, in public life in Orthodoxy, and V'lisod Haaretz having to do with being a citizen of the country and a citizen of the world. So, with that in mind, we'll get some background in the next couple of pages, but our goal here is going to be to see how he tackled issues. What I really want to show is not merely the couple of things, these two examples out of nearly countless items that he addressed himself to and contributed to, but how he approached them, and sort of get into the thinking, and to see exactly, as best we can, how he came to a conclusion. So we have a timeline here on page 2. Basically it divides his life into three perhaps obvious major periods. The pre-America period, from birth in 1917 to his bar mitzvah in 1930 in Warsaw, starting in Chaslavich in Western Russia, and then ending in Warsaw at the time when his father and older brother of Yosheber were already in New York. Then his migration to New York, where he spent the next 36 years and, grew up, went from bar mitzvah to Rabbi in yeshiva, and noted Talmud scholar, and noted Talmud scholar is an understatement, I think, especially in his New York years. He was much celebrated and widely loved and admired. Perhaps even at that point being recognized as an important or a towering figure on the international halachic scene. So one of the Gedolei Torah even then. And then in 1966, moving to Chicago to take the helm of the Hebrew Theological College, the Skokie Yeshiva, and didn't take too long for fissures to appear between his point of view and the way he wanted to conduct matters, conduct life at the Skokie Yeshiva and in Chicago generally. and the way the board of directors wanted it, and some of the faculty, much of the community. The Orthodox community then was significantly divided at that time between sides that were created by this fissure. And so that marked the first, didn't happen right away, but I'd say from certainly in the early 70s. So the first half of the 70s was marked by that period of difficulty and controversy. After that, he founded Brisk Yeshiva. He had a very personal setback with the stroke that he suffered in 1983. But he didn't stop, he kept going, and not long after that, when his brother, Rav Yosef Dov, the Rav, was no longer able to give shiurim in New York at YU, Rav Aaron Soloveichik stepped in and commuted from Chicago to New York the way Rav Yosef Dov had been commuting from Boston to New York all those years. Rav Aaron did that in his later years and with his stroke. By the way, another thing we could write a whole book about is the legend of Rav Aaron, because it was like around this time that he started becoming sort of legendary. And you find a lot of stories that were told in connection, after he died, and in the eulogies, and then the Yortzeit memorials, and so on, about his extraordinary humanness and kindness and help to others, and reaching out to people. People who he might have nothing to do with, stories about encountering somebody at a baseball game whose wife was a nurse in the hospital, and Rabbi Soloveichik was just the angelic person that she met in the hospital, and you just had these wild kind of connections and almost random encounters with people who were blown away by Rav Aaron's personality. Other stories about his from flight attendants at United or whatever airline it was that he used to take in his commuting to New York. So this was an important part. This was part of what developed in those years, in his later years. In 2001, around Tisha B'Av, his wife died of cancer that she had been suffering from for a while. And then not too long after that, a couple, 2-3 months after that, in fact, his Yortzeit was just last week during Chol HaMoed Sukkot, and he died, shortly after Tisha B'Av as well during the same year. The tributes I mentioned here, I pick out these two on page 3 because they are they represent, so each represents in its own way something important. There are many tributes, especially as I say in the eulogies and so on. But these are important in their own way. First of all, the one that appears on the website of Hebrew Theological College and also appears on the, and it's, it's reproduced. They happen to have over there this kind of flashing or rotating electronic board that shows all of their past Rosh Yeshiva and biographies. And this is the biography that appears for Rabbi Soloveichik. And as you read this, think about the difficulties of the early 70s and the ability to rise above all of that. I think are remarkable. Just selecting some passages from this in the top paragraph on page 3. Rav Aaron was a remarkable genius. He learned and taught utilizing the brisker derech of analysis and was also a bucky expert in Shas, Poskim, and Tanakh. Even after suffering a debilitating stroke, Rav Aaron would still learn day and night, giving shiurim which could last for hours. All true. In character, he was a humble, kind man, yet with an iron will and unquestionable integrity. They knew about that. But anyway, part of the reason of this is to kind of give credit to the yeshiva for being able to rise above the fray many years after the fact. But in effect, at least on some levels, bygones can be bygones, and that seems to be where their head is at right now. The second selection from Rabbi Lichtenstein, alav hashalom, is important, for one thing, because it's almost impossible to talk about Rav Aaron Soloveichik today without quoting Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, and especially this particular passage from his short essay called "The Source of Faith is Faith Itself." This is something where they had asked a number of rabbis, prominent rabbis, to speak to this question of what was their source of faith. And Rav Lichtenstein chose to work on the theme of, the inspiration that you get from your Rabbeim, and some flash of faith and inspiration that pre-exists any thinking through of the issues, is what gives rise to the desire to think through the issues and to develop one's faith and inspiration. So one of the Rabbeim that he mentions, he had three: the elder Rav Soloveichik, Rav Yosef Dov, and Rav Hutner at Yeshivat Chaim Berlin. He was close with the family already from the days in Europe, in Warsaw. And while Rav Yosef Dov and Rav Moshe, who are, Rav Aaron's father, Rav Moshe, well, they were in America, and Rav Aaron was studying for his bar mitzvah and so on, Rav Hutner would study with him in Warsaw. So they were very close. And Rav Lichtenstein then fit into that triad. So he speaks about those three, and I guess the key thing that you can't avoid anymore in talking about Rav Aaron is the underlined passage that, speaking about Rav Aaron, while an inspiring vision, yet somehow seemed within reach and truly presented a model, it wasn't so much what he said or did. I was simply enthralled by what he was, a remarkable fusion of mastery and simplicity, of vigor and humility, and above all, a pillar of radical integrity. Coining a phrase there that will forever be associated with Rav Aaron Lichtenstein and Rav Aaron Soloveichik. Okay, so that's the background. Now let's dig into the substantive materials. Would anybody like to ask any questions or comment or get up and stretch? Rabbi.
I was asked if you agreed with this assessment. It's a beautiful...
His assessment?
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting you say that, because actually I always wondered why he chose that phrase, radical integrity. So why radical integrity? It's not hard to understand why he spoke of Rav Aaron, his memory of Rav Aaron. I think at that time it wasn't a memory, but his impression of Rav Aaron as having, as surrounding the idea of integrity. That's clear. And the HTC thing says that about him and so on. That's Rav Aaron. And if he had said something like extreme integrity, that would be understandable. Great integrity, that would be understandable. What did he mean by radical integrity? And I have hypothesized, and I emphasize that this is my personal hypothesis about what Rav Aaron Lichtenstein meant when he used that adjective of radical integrity, because it also happens to fit with my own perception of Rav Aaron. And that was When you say someone has integrity, that means that he or she themselves, are perfectly honest, stand up, you can depend on them, reliable, all those things. If you say that they are extremely, they have extreme integrity, intense integrity, so that means that they're just way on the far side of being having extreme integrity. What radical integrity tells me, and this is absolutely Ravarin, is that he wasn't satisfied with having integrity himself, but he wanted everybody else to have integrity. He insisted and demanded that everyone have integrity. What he tried to do was not only sort of increase the amount of truth and justice in the world, but to, by adding to it, but to subtract from the untruth that was already there, and thereby to increase the integrity. So that's what it means to me, so thanks for asking that. Well, I was once sharing this explanation of radical integrity many years ago at a fundraiser for Har Etzion, where Rabbi Lichtenstein was present. And I was talking actually to Rabbi Engel from Torah about it. And he said, well, that's an interesting explanation. And Rabbi Lichtenstein's right there on the other side of the room. Why don't we go ask him if that's what he meant? I said, no. Well, right. Well, there was some of that, right? The fear and awe. But more it was, the artist has produced his work and now it's mine to interpret. So his work is my Rembrandt. And so I can't say that it's necessarily what, I have no idea if it's what Rabbi Lichtenstein had in mind, but it's what I took from those words. So yes, I would agree. Okay, so Unit 1. Unit 1 is going to be on the expanding role of women in Judaism. Now, here I want to say I have coined my own phrase. I believe that Rabbi Soloveichik, and as we'll see, Rabbi Soloveichik was, in some respects, he developed some of these ideas in the 1960s. In some respects, the ideas that we see, at least the way they are framed, can seem dated. And while they may be dated in that respect, but they had a life of their own, and they had their influence over time. And it's the influence that's especially important to us today. Maybe as a historical matter, and reviewing the history and development of his thought and his works, how they fit into the times and how they fit into future times would be interesting. But to me, what's important about them is the larger impression that they give. Now, this is especially true. It's almost especially true in this very first one. This is Avi Weiss, I think a name that's recognized by everybody. Avi Weiss has his book Women in Prayer, which itself might be a dated document. I don't know how he speaks of it, but about women's prayer groups, and the thinking on women at prayer has come a long way since Women at Prayer, and of course this was perhaps a revolutionary work that helped move it into the next generation. So he quotes Ravarin a lot in this book. You just look in the index of the book if you happen to have it, and Rabbi Soloveichik is quoted many times. And one of the key places is in this quotation, and it's important to this. Basically, it's footnote 6 here that I'm really getting at on this page. And the importance of it is, it was important to Ravarin too, because Ravarin used to repeat this. I even noticed recently in one of the blogs, this forum blog, if anybody sees that, this forum blog, they were talking about the theory that's enunciated right here in this footnote. They footnoted it to one of the written works that Rabbi Soloveichik has, but apparently he was picking up on, or there is a whole intellectual trend that can be traced from Hirsch and rabbis even before that about this point. And this has to do with the relative place of women and men within halacha. And Rabbi Soloveichik makes the highly interesting point, an intriguing point, that we were just reading Bereshit last week, and he makes the intriguing point that the creation of the world seems to follow progressive stages of advancement. So starting with inorganic matter, the simplest primal power, energy, and working its way up in complexity into organic, vegetation, and animal life, and then man. But the story does not stop there. Man is the penultimate creation. The ultimate creation is woman. And he takes that quite literally to mean that women are on a higher spiritual plane than men. And that's spelled out in this footnote and in the underlined text here. And, but that's the basic idea. The idea of women being superior to men, it really confounded a lot of people at the time. Rabbi, I remember I was a student at the yeshiva at the time, and I remember him giving this speech in the yeshiva, and a lot of the rabbis sort of shaking their heads and not clearly agreeing. And while it's dated, because, you know, by now women, of course, have disowned the idea of not having no interest in being set on a pedestal, being superior to anybody, but just having equal rights. And that's the focus today. But one thing that remains, I believe, and that we'll see in further selections, is his respect for women. And his basic respect for women as not being inferior. That's the least, at least what we can take from this, that's of lasting importance. So whether we want to think about women as being superior may be less important than whether women should be thought of as inferior, which of course has been, and in many places, surprising places today, continues to be how people, men, think about women, and maybe even some women think about women. And then in the second selection on page 5, there is his perhaps less repeated, but certainly attributable to him, concept of Tuma and Tara, which of course ties in with ideas of family purity. Is the idea of family purity to relegate women to some rejected and unwanted place, or does it have a broader, more important philosophical meaning than that? And of course, Rabbi Soloveichik identified more uplifting ideas involved in that process, and to the point that Avi Weiss felt that they could form a portion of his own analysis of women at prayer. Now that led then to the development of women's prayer groups, and if we move to page 6 and 7 in women's prayer groups, this is these are excerpts from an article written by Aryeh and Dov Frimmer, as you can see on the top of page 6. They've written a lot of critiques of different suggestions for advancing women's place in the synagogue, partnership minyanim, and so on. They've written halachic critiques. And they wrote essentially a review, a literature review, if you will, of, in their day, in an earlier time, in 1998, of women's prayer groups. They weren't able to get from Ravaran the kind of unilateral rejection of the idea that I think they were hoping for. Now here too, we have something that might fall short of what we would want from someone we deemed a feminist today. Because he questioned, essentially, he focused on this one question, basically, which was, are women asking for prayer groups because they are genuinely motivated by a religious consideration to come closer to God, and this is the way that women wish to come closer to God? In that case, as you'll see from these materials, in that case, he was completely for it, as long as it didn't, cross over technical halachic considerations of brachot and so on. Where he stopped short was in expressing his own doubts about whether that was exactly what women wanted, or what all women, you can't really speak for all women at any, on any particular issue. He was concerned at that time that the motivation may not have been correct in all cases. He was fond, actually, in a completely different context, he was fond of quoting someone who, among the European rabbis in pre-war period, as saying that the Hasidim needed to go through their process of having to face the mitnagdim, who fought them tooth and nail, and excommunicated them in the 18th century, and then Hasidim eventually emerged as a fully normative and accepted part of the Orthodox community, some Rabbanim were quoted as saying that what brought them to that place was exactly the testing, the crucible of going through the opposition of the mitnagdim, and that was needed to sort of clean out some of the stray elements of Chassidut, of early Chassidut, that may have strayed from genuine orthodoxy. And I think, here I never heard him say this, but I think that there's a similar idea in it, thinking that there's a process, and not everything that everybody recommends is in 1998 and before that in the 1990s is necessarily to be swallowed whole right away. But what you could always count on Rabbi Soloveichik for was taking it seriously, taking what the women were asking for seriously, and finally taking a favorable view of it based on their own sincerity. And so how he would feel about this today, I don't know. I think that clearly women in Orthodoxy have come a very long way over all this time, have put a lot of sweat equity into their study of Torah and so on, and teaching of Torah. So there's been a lot of progress since 1998 in women establishing their own bona fide sincerity in advancing their religiosity. Finally, on page 8, we have something much more recent. This is on the question, within the same unit of women's place in Orthodoxy, the question of women saying Kaddish for a parent. And there's in this wonderful book, I saw this first in a Jofa publication they call Tashma, which are their sort of source sheet, halachic analysis papers. But then most of them were reprinted with the addition of one or two, including one from our own Sarah Wolkenfeld in the book Hilchot Nashim. So this article on women reciting Kaddish, daughters reciting Kaddish, by Rachel Berkovitz, was reprinted there too. And here she quotes Rabbi Soloveichik as being, if you look through the footnotes and the material appearing after her quotation of his work, in which he emphatically almost insists that women be permitted to say Kaddish, perhaps even encouraged to do so, but certainly not prevented from doing so when women want to and feel the need to do so. He did not utter a question about their sincerity in doing so here, and I don't know if that's because the context was different or time had elapsed. But there was no question of sincerity, and he turned out to be one of the strongest voices among the recognized Orthodox poskim in favor of women being able to say Kaddish for a parent, even when others are not saying Kaddish, and so on. I have a couple of notes here on some points that Rachel Berkovitz makes about Rabbi Soloveitchik's selection here. I won't go into them right now, but if there's an interest, maybe you can make sense of my notes. So then I'd like to go into Unit 2. Unit 2 is the Jew as a citizen of America and a citizen of the world. One good exposition of Rabbi Soloveitchik's thinking about this is from Meir Soloveitchik's Torah and Western Thought. Meir Soloveitchik, as you may know, is his grandson, but a very prominent lecturer and rabbi, pulpit rabbi, and speaker in New York now. And he published this book called Torah and Western Thought, which focuses on, I don't know, about a dozen leading spokesmen for orthodoxy in the modern world. And he himself wrote the article or the chapter on Rav Yosef Dov and Rav Aron. Now this is very important because there is a very important ethic that Rabbi Soloveitchik had, for which he was unique. He cared about and respected not only the welfare of Jews, but the welfare of humanity. And he was genuinely interested in humanity. You'll see some of the quotes here, but he himself, some of the central ideas are what you see like in the middle of the page, on page 9, the famous story of Shimon ben Shetach, who was a great Talmudic rabbi. He was working extremely hard, he was poor, and his students decided that he needed a donkey to help him out, and they got one from a non-Jewish person, and it turned out, lo and behold, when they brought the donkey home, that there was a pearl in it that the non-Jewish seller, Arab, was not even aware of, because they certainly had not paid for the pearl. And they said, Shimon ben Shetach saw that, and he said, well, go return it. You have to return the pearl. And they said, well, why do we have to return the pearl? The strict halacha is that we're allowed to keep the lost articles of a non-Jewish person. And he said, in effect, that's the strict halacha. I don't care about strict halacha. I have to go beyond strict halacha. And what we're interested in is, the way he put it, we're interested more in the non-Jewish seller respecting Judaism and our God and our principles We have more of a vested interest in that than I have in enriching myself off of somebody else's wealth. And so that's the cornerstone Shimon ben Shetach story that's so important in Rav Aharon's thinking. He never tolerated, some of the abuses that we unfortunately hear about too often, of course, in the Orthodox community, about unfair business practices, about cheating on taxes. In some quarters, that's a game. It's taken for granted that, we have our halacha, we have our Shulchan Aruch, and that's what we have to live by, and we don't have to live by some international, universal ethics encompassing all of humankind. And Rabbi Soloveichik was disgusted by that attitude and often spoke up about it. When I was a student in the yeshiva, and those of my generation remember these events like this, vividly. He would speak in the Beis Midrash about, since '72, when Nixon is up for re-election. And a little bit like today, I don't want to get political, but a little bit like today in the sense that a vast majority of the Orthodox community was Republican because they felt that Nixon was more supportive of Israel than the Orthodox, and so, than the Democrats. And so there was a lot of talk about how you have to vote for Nixon. And Rabbi Soloveichik would thunder from the pulpit that you may not vote for Nixon. Nixon is a rotzeach, a murderer, and you must vote for McGovern, he said. Now, keep in mind that most of his audience were teenage boys who were not voting for anybody. But I think he said that was the audience that I was part of. But he said that in more than one place. But anyway, the point was not so much merely going against the Orthodox tide, which was not hard for him, but his concern for the Vietnamese people and what he considered to be the excesses of American warmongering policy and the whole anti-communist thing. Obviously, all conversations, separate conversations to be had. I want to read actually something outside of the source sheets. Whoops. We have a strict deadline or something, or what's the deal? Should I wait for people?
We started 5 minutes late, so I can give you 5 minutes, then go.
Okay, so let me see. I do want to mention this one thing, and I only saw this after I put the source sheet together. I would have put it in, but he had this is critical to his ethics of how we are to deal with humanity. And it was originally published in 1966 in this article, Jew and Jew, Jew and non-Jew. So he feels that there's a difference between the way we treat Jews and the way we treat non-Jews, even though we have to treat non-Jews with respect and honestly. But Jews are still on a different level, and that's why you get this kind of issue where in the Shimon ben Shetach story, where according to the strict halacha, the pearl perhaps did not have to be returned to the unwitting non-Jewish seller who in effect lost it, and maybe the halacha didn't require returning it. Of course, had it been a Jewish seller, the halacha would have required returning it. And yet, on a higher moral plane, Shimon ben Shetach and Rav Aharon and others after him considered it an absolute ethical, moral imperative, if not a halachic requirement. And here's how he explains it. I just want to read this because I think it's so central to his thinking about the world. He says, 2 kinds of ahava. The question arises of what significance is the application of love of Israel if there is an obligation of love of mankind that is applicable to all men, which he had been explicating in the earlier pages of this essay. But it seems that there is a definite distinction between the two. There are 2 kinds of love. There is intellectual love, love deriving from the logic of the mind, marked by an objective view of the person that is loved. And then there is also emotional love, springing from the heart. Emotional love is not based on any logic of the mind. It is blind. Ahavat habriot, which is coextensive with the whole human race, must be based upon a full cognizance of the good qualities possessed by men, as well as the frailties that can be found in each and every person. Love of mankind, based upon the teaching, beloved is man, for he was created in the image of God. It's in the 3rd chapter, I think, of Avot, Pirkei Avot, is key to the idea of human dignity. It bespeaks the fact that every human being is endowed with kavod, dignity, and hadar, majesty, crowned with honor and beauty, as David says in Psalms. But then in regard to Yisrael, now here this is the important distinction, there is an obligation of blind love, love that springs from the heart rather than the mind. So it's more unconditional, we might say, an unconditional kind of love. That's the love that we have, that's v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. So that's the love we have for other Jews. It's not judgmental, but the love that we have for mankind exists. It's obligatory, but it's weighed by, it's conditional. There is a wisdom of the heart, just there is a wisdom of the mind. This is shown in the debate, etc. I won't go into that. Okay. I mention this because this is absolutely central to his thinking. So let me just run through the rest of the materials. I'll just mention what's in them and why they're here. On page 11, there is a Hebrew selection from his halachic work, Parach Matei Aharon. This is interesting because of the light it sheds or could shed on gun control issues in halacha. This is Rabbi Soloveitchik's, he takes the Rambam in his code, in Maimonides' code, as his springboard. And in this selection, Maimonides talks about the prohibition of selling weapons to people who can't be trusted to use them correctly. And there is such a prohibition, except in the paragraph before the one cited here, he says that it's absolutely prohibited to sell weapons to pagans and others who can't be trusted, people who are wild. Here he says that if they also serve a police purpose, then it is permissible to sell it to them, even though they may also use it for other purposes and for villainous purposes. And he goes into the question of how can it be under any circumstances that it might be permissible to sell weapons to someone who might use it to murder others. And he answers that question on, in using a halachic analysis. I never talked to Rabbi Soloveichik about gun control. It wasn't quite the issue in those days that it is today, sadly. And so I don't know. I'm not saying that I know that he would derive gun control principles from his interpretation of the Rambam. But one reason that I mention it is because I wouldn't be surprised if he did. And I think that's exactly how he looked at the world. So it would not be surprising. Now, there might be some exceptions or something. As I say, I didn't hear it from him. But it would not be surprising if he developed an ethic of gun control, or a policy on gun control, based on what he felt was the right interpretation of the Rambam. Just below that on page 11 is a poem written by his wife, Ella Soloveichik of blessed memory. I'm sorry I can't read it now and translate it. It's not easy. And it's very interesting. So if anyone has an interest in this subject generally, then Ella Soloveichik, who was certainly, a partner of his in all respects, is worth the time. She was an accomplished poet and Bible scholar. Also, I don't know if people heard the Straw Hat podcast for Breshit, but if you heard the interview of Ethan Schwartz by the Rabbanit, you can see why I would hesitate actually to read this poem, because I'm sure I wouldn't be reading it correctly in all its detail. Anyway, so that's just a plug for...
That only assumes that he listens to watches the video.
Yeah. And then finally, we have two things. One is a letter written by our own Asher Lopatin on page 12, and I think you'll find that interesting, his own relationship. I think everyone who knows Rabbi Lopatin knows that he had a close relationship with Rabbi Soloveichik. Here he describes why. And then finally, this isn't easy, but it's now become a classic on 13 and 14. This is the correspondence between Rav Aaron Soloveichik and his father and his brother. So Rav Aaron was 10 years old, and he had this whole explanation of the Rambam that seems quite sophisticated, certainly beyond his years. And his father says, that's nice, but I'm not sure I agree. And then he sent it on to his brother. The father sent it to the brother because they had this active correspondence while Rav Yosef Dov was in Berlin in the 1920s, maybe 30s, but in the 1920s. No, not the 30s, because he was already here. But in the 1920s, he was in Berlin getting his doctorate at the University of Berlin. And of course, those are whole subjects unto themselves. But they had this correspondence. And so it went from Rav Aaron's ideas to Rav Moshe's, the father's skepticism. And then Rav Yosef Dov completely rejecting it. As Rav Aaron later would say, yes, he tore me apart. And it's all extremely interesting. Partly because of the very content of what's in here. It's an extremely interesting topic of whether killing the Egyptian, but by Moses killing the Egyptian that he kills, before he runs away from Egypt as he's growing up and before he becomes the leader of the Jewish people, whether that was considered murder or whether that was actually considered an act of killing, because according to Talmudic sources, he killed him using the Shem HaMeforosh, so in a Kabbalistic way. He didn't shoot him, he didn't stab him, he used a Kabbalistic mystical way of depriving him of life. So is that considered a killing? So Rabbi Soloveichik dealt with that question, and then his father and his brother jump all over him. But they're all very impressed that at the age of 10 he could write this, and so are we.
Thank you very much. For coming. We have 2 more lectures in this series, and then the rest of the semester we will have other topics. And thank you so much for joining us.
Okay. Right, absolutely.
Can we get this on YouTube?
Yeah, we'll be on YouTube.